So thank you very much, and I hope people like the sort of clever title with its double meaning and so on. I'm going to be talking about the concept of alienation, and often when non-Marxists talk about alienation, they're talking about the sort of kids that I see hanging around town looking hopeless and lost, or they're thinking about people who feel cut off from the world of politics. They feel that no one stands for them, represents them. They feel completely divorced from the establishment. Or they're thinking about the kind of kids I teach in my university who feel hopeless about the future and the prospects for them. Or they're thinking about all those people who live in urban settings, these vast concentrations of human beings. I mean, urbanization has really taken over the world in recent decades. But yet people feel desperately lonely, isolated, and lead these very atomized lives. And often when Marxists talk about alienation, they say, well, I'm going to put all that stuff to one side, and I'm going to talk about the Marxist theory. And my starting point is, I think, is a little bit different. I want to say that the Marxist theory of alienation is about all of those things. But what the Marxist theory of alienation does is it goes beyond simply descriptions of suffering, and it talks about how these things are systematically tied to capitalism as a form of class society, and much more importantly, it talks about the possibility of transcending these human conditions, the possibility of liberation through working class struggles. Now, how do we get to that point? I think that the starting point in understanding Marx's theory of alienation is to understand what it is that makes us distinctively human. And this is a really foundational point within Marxism. Marx talks about human beings as a distinct part of nature, but we distinguish ourselves from nature, he argues, through our ability to reproduce ourselves through a conscious collective labour process. It's through particular, purposive, conceptualised forms of activity through which we interact with nature that we sustain ourselves, reproduce ourselves as human societies. And this is very, very distinctive from other animals that we encounter within nature. As Marx says somewhere, bees and ants can achieve feats that rival those of the greatest architect. But, and I'm paraphrasing Marx here, the bee doesn't wake up in the morning and think, what kind of hive-building activity am I going to do today, at least as far as we know. That's not what bees do. You know, if you take you take a zebra and place it on Peckham High Street, it will try to do zebra-type activities. And even if you take 100 zebras and put them together on Peckham High Street, they will still do zebra things to much sort of hilarity for passers-by. Because to a certain extent, they're bound by their nature to do those things. And of course, in evolutionary terms, they will eventually adapt and transform their nature. But human beings are distinct because we routinely, on a day-to-day basis, can conceptualize our activity, think through what we're going to do, and then collectively, consciously engage in those activities through which we transform both nature, and as we transform nature and take nature into our bodies and interact with nature in increasingly complex ways, we also transform ourselves, our capacities, and the kind of societies that we live in. And human beings do this not just in one particular set of ecological circumstances, but they do this in an extraordinarily variegated way across every single corner of the planet, and even sort of going out into outer space or into the depths of the ocean, human beings still engage in these labour-type activities through which they interact with nature. In other words, labour, this labour process, this active, conscious, collective activity, this labour process is for Marx what he calls a form of metabolism between humans and nature. And this interaction between humans and nature, this very distinctive way that human beings do it, is what makes us human. And this affects human beings in all kinds of very complex ways. If you think about language, language is one of the ways in which we conceptualize the world or describe it in increasingly abstract terms. But what is language? Language is, Marx argues, practical consciousness. It arises from the necessity to interact with other human beings in this process of transformation of nature and the world, which creates society. So these forms of activity also transform the human beings and give rise to all kinds of complex societies. And we see this in every form of human society. So we go back to the most, the earliest forms of hunter-gatherer societies. These are largely egalitarian societies constructed around these collective social forms of labour. It's why both Marx and Engels use this term primitive communism to describe these earliest forms of society. And as we engage in these processes, labour itself becomes a need for humanity. Not in the simplistic sense, not just in the simplistic sense that if we don't labour, we don't eat. I mean, obviously, that's true. We are bound by our material nature, of course, in complex ways. But it's more profound than that. Labour makes us human. It's how we co-create our society, understand our place within it. And as we engage in labour, more complex needs emerge. The need for culture, understanding, science, the ability to construct more complex forms of labour themselves emerge as a need within these social settings. And this is just an aside, but it's something we glimpse all the time in very different ways. I was thinking a few weeks ago about the kind of books that I like to read as a child. And the books that appealed to me as a child were books about groups of children co-creating their own society through complex forms of labour. I think about, I don't know if people know the book Emil and the Detectives by, what's his name, Eric Kastner, whose books were burned by the Nazis, so he must have been a pretty good guy. Or the collection of books Swallows and Amazons by Arthur Ransome, who incidentally was a huge supporter of the 1917 revolution. Or the Jennings books by Anthony Buckeridge, who was also a raving socialist, all of which tells you a lot about the house that I grew up in, by the way, the kind of books we had access to. I won't even go on about Tove Jansson and people like that. But the point is, what appeals to you about this is this kind of collective creation of society through activity. And it's a very appealing concept, I think. And conversely, very few of us, however lazy we think we are, find fulfillment through pure passivity. You think about the kind of things that we do, making terrible music on our guitars if people are engaging in those kind of activities, or doing art in our free time, or DIY, and so on. We don't feel drained by these activities. We feel fulfilled and refreshed by these activities we carry on in our spare time, which are quite significant expenditures of energy, but it doesn't leave us feeling drained. Why not? Because it's an expression of what we are as human beings. And even among groups of quite middle-class professional people, I spent a lot of time in America a few years ago and hung out with lots of quite well-to-do professional people. There's this same fascination that you encounter with things like intentional communities. How do we create from the ground up our own sort of utopian little enclave within the world? Usually, by the way, this doesn't go much further than dropping acid at Burning Man, but it's a real phenomenon. It's a real yearning that people feel in society. Now, Marx, who sadly never made it to Burning Man, nonetheless did talk about communism with a small c, distinguishing from what Stalin called communism, which is a very different thing. But when Marx talked about communism with a small c, he talked about a society in which we seize control of the enormous scientific understanding, culture, productive technique bequeathed to us by capitalism, and we use it to do something quite different. About 25 years ago, I think there was this banner that popped up on lots of anti-capitalist protests, which had this wonderful slogan, overthrow capitalism and replace it with something nicer. What's the something nicer? Well, this is what Marx meant. A world of free, collective labour in which we democratically, sustainably find ways of collectively working on nature to fulfil human beings, taking with us all that is bequeathed to us by capitalism, but using it in a completely different way. Marx sometimes expresses this much more succinctly with the word freedom. And that's what Marx means when he talks about freedom in his writings. Now, this idea of labour as an element of freedom couldn't be further detached from the reality of the most important forms of work that many of us do, the kind of works that put bread on our table and allow us to exist. Work inside a capitalist workplace is entering a realm of unfreedom, if you like. And Marx's ideas on alienation explain why this is the case. They're largely worked out in a wonderful manuscript, the 1844 Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts by Marx, which you can buy from bookmarks and read. Marx is a very precocious 26-year-old. I remember rereading passages when I was 26 and thinking, I will never amount to a Marx. For those of you in the room who are not yet 26, by the way, this is something to aspire to. But these are wonderful manuscripts which reflect the young Marx, this very precocious figure who's been trained in German philosophy, who's joined this democratic radical movement in Germany, and then flees to Paris, really escaping from the attention of the German authorities. And in Paris, he begins encountering working class circles, talking to other communists and socialists that he encounters in Paris. He meets Frederick Engels and forms a partnership with him. Engels has just come back from industrial Manchester and so on. And he begins to think, I'm interested in these kind of social questions. I need to start making a study of this thing called capitalism that's emerging around us and refashioning the world and everything within it. And he begins a series of interrogations of what capitalism is, how it functions, which will continue right up until his dying day in 1883. So it's, really a 40-year process of discovery in Marx. But it's in these very early studies that he recognises some crucial things about what capitalism does to workers. The first element of alienation for Marx is that under capitalism, very different from, say, a hunter-gatherer society, you do not consume the things that you produce in a capitalist workplace. If you're in a car plant, you don't work in order to consume cars. You might own a car, but you don't routinely consume the cars that you produce. You're producing the cars for an alien entity in society. You're producing the cars for the capitalist. And this takes very intense form. If you work in a Foxconn factory in China, assembling iPhones like this one, it would take you 6 months of starving yourself, of not buying food, clothing, not paying rent, and so on, just to afford one of the iPhones that you help to assemble. The thing that you are making belongs to an alien presence in society, not a literal alien from space, but someone who is not you, someone who is an alien figure in this society. So the worker is not labouring to engage in the collective reproduction of themselves, but simply to earn money to buy things to live. The labourer becomes, as Marx puts it in the 1844 manuscripts, an abstract activity and a belly. You're not engaging in fulfilment of what it is to be a human. So the product confronts the worker, the thing they produce confronts them as something alien, Marx says, as a possession of another. And not only that, the more that you produce, the more you are creating a mass of alienated capital that confronts you as a worker, swelling to enormous size in the form form of Apple or Foxconn or Walmart or Tesco, these giant accumulations of wealth created by workers, but then set against those workers. So that's the first element of alienation. But secondly, Marx argues, productive activity itself becomes alienated because it's subject to the control and direction of another. Not only are we producing for another, but everything about how we produce is dictated for us by this alien, by this capitalist presence. And this leads to a feeling, as Marx puts it, where the worker, I'm quoting Marx, the worker only feels himself outside of his work, and in his work feels outside of himself. He feels at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he does not feel at home. Its alien character, the labour process, emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no compulsion exists, labour is shunned like the plague. So this world of work is not a realm of freedom, it's a realm of being told what to do to produce wealth for another, being directed and driven by another. And this means that we are in turn, this is the third element, we are alienated from our very nature, because our being as human beings is precisely this process of collective, conscious activity on nature, but this activity is no longer our own. It's completely controlled and governed by another. So labour simply becomes a means to an end. And the final dimension of alienation Marx talks about is that it alienates us from our fellow humans. Marx insists that the human is, above all else, a social animal, a gregarious animal, as he puts it somewhere, that through this labour process forms these social relationships with others. And in this alienation process, this capacity, this ability to freely enter into relations with others is stripped away, atomizing us and separating us from our fellow humans, casting us adrift as individuals in an alienated world. And this is very, very important because it helps to explain, and this is a point I'm going to return to a bit later on, how workers' ideological conception of themselves and of capitalism is shaped under capitalism. We often, when you first sort of radicalise, become a socialist or an anti-capitalist or whatever, you often look back at the people who haven't sort of had this sort of road to Damascus experience, think, oh, all these stupid people who believe all this stupid stuff about and vote for Reform UK and have racist ideas or backward ideas or whatever it is, how stupid, not remembering that maybe 6 months or a year ago you maybe shared some of these ideas. But Marx is saying this is not because people are stupid. I mean, supporting Reform UK maybe stupid, but it's not just about that. We have to ask, why is it people are prone to accept these ideas that run contrary to their interest? Well, in part it's because their conception of themselves in society is divorced from their ability to collectively transform the world through their labour in partnership with their fellow humans. And this atomised conception of ourselves leaves us prone to all sorts of ideas that in fact originate within the ruling class, including racism, sexism, and so on and so forth. Now, there is a very tedious debate about alienation sparked by the communist philosopher and all-round bad guy Louis Althusser, which I'm not going to talk about at great length, but there's this idea that the young Marx is interested in humanity and alienation and so on, but the old Marx is interested in these impersonal capitalist systems and isn't really interested in human beings and so on. That was the young humanist Marx. This is nonsense. This preoccupation with labour and alienation runs right the way through Marx's works, right up to his dying day. Let me just give you a passage from Capital. So, he comes across this idea of alienation in 1844. This is Marx writing 23 years later in Capital. All means for the development of production becomes means of domination and exploitation. They distort the worker into a fragment of a man. They degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine. They destroy the actual content of his labour by turning it into a torment. They alienate him from his intellectual potentiality in the labour process, and so on and so on. This is a preoccupation running all the way through the works of Marx. But I think one thing that is transformed is that Marx further enriches and develops this concept of alienation in quite important ways. And this comes from Marx developing, particularly in the manuscripts of Capital, a much more sophisticated and rich understanding of capitalism, and also a much richer and historicised conception of society through a whole number of works he writes after 1844. And I just want to touch on a couple of ways in which that's important. The first is that in Capital, you get a much more developed concept of the capitalist labour process and what that looks like. One of the key elements, which is later picked up by Harry Braverman, a very important American Marxist in the 60s and 70s, who writes a book called Labour and Monopoly Capitalism, is the way in which, in this process of labour, in order to maximise the extraction of value from workers, the capitalist seeks to systematically rob the worker of a rounded understanding of the labour process, to monopolise in the hands of capital the full understanding of this process. And you see how this further shatters the relationship between the mental and manual dimensions of a labour process. All free activity, all free labour would inherently involve mental capacity as well as physical capacity, but these are torn apart under capitalism. The capitalist has to understand the labour process and use that to monitor, to direct labour more effectively, to squeeze them harder, and so on and so forth. And by the way, this is not just something that happens in factories. I work in a university. I lose count of the number of ways in which there is an attempt to not just understand what it is I do, which is quite hard for some of my bosses to understand, but to quantify it, to measure it, to work out how they can extract more research, more teaching, more efficiently, and not just that, but to automate elements of my labour process. This is part of the discourse of artificial intelligence in the university. All these kind of processes that you associate with the factories of Marx's day, you see in a slightly different form within white-collar, so-called intellectual, mental labour processes as well, which are never purely mental, as anyone who has worked at these jobs fully understands when they sort of stumble home exhausted after a 10-hour shift inside a university or school or civil service job. So that's one of the ways in which Marx further enriches this conception. The other way I think the concept is enriched is through these broader concepts that he talks about, particularly in Capital, of fetishization and reification. I don't have time to develop this at length, but I just want to point out a couple of aspects of this. The first is what Marx calls the fetishism of commodities. What does he mean by this? Not fetish as in sort of leatherware and, all that kind of stuff. Fetish in the sort of anthropological sense of these objects within which are sort of mystified within, or this is a concept, within so-called primitive societies, as the anthropologists of Marx's day would see it, to which are attributed these magical powers and so on. Marx is using this term to describe what happens to the commodity under capitalism. And he says that the commodity itself becomes this mystified sort of constellation of social relations. So, for example, if we go into a store and I buy a loaf of bread, what am I really doing? I'm exchanging the product of my labour process, this work I do in a university, that is a really complex labour process, tying me to other lecturers, support staff, the cleaners who clean the lecture theatres, and so on and so forth. All these kind of social labours grouped together in my activity. I then get this money. I then go and buy this other product of social labour, this bread that is probably made from wheat that may come from Canada, labour produced by this other labour process, milled in this factory, packaged, shipped, and so on, stored in a warehouse. All these kind of complex forms of social labour. But what form does it take? An abstract exchange of some coins for a loaf of bread. And it conceals all these deeper social relations within it that get hidden in the context of commodity exchange. And there's a much, much wider sense in capital in the way that this process fragments different groups of workers, isolates them, atomizes them. And as this picture of production becomes more fragmented, it becomes, Marx says, naturalized. Because we lose the threads of social connection, it confronts us as sort of alienated, natural phenomena. And we see this in a million ways. You think about how economics is talked about. I'll just give you one little example. When they say, oh, the British government can't do this because the bond market wouldn't tolerate it, they're talking about real bond traders, human beings engaging in a social and economic relationship. But the bond market is treated like this natural phenomena that is natural and therefore unchangeable, eternal, can't be disrupted, and so on. So capitalism, through these kind of processes, naturalizes itself and establishes itself more deeply. Okay, final point I want to make. So out of this process, we have this all-pervasive loss of control within capitalism. Loss of control within the workplace, but also, and Marx makes this point, even the individual capitalists lose control. They make decisions that individually are perfectly rational in their own narrow terms, but what's the end result? A system out of control. Ecological disruption, economic crisis periodically, and so on and so forth. So this is the nature of capitalism. But it's very important to go back to this earlier conception of labour to grasp the double-edged nature of alienation in Marx. Because Marx is not arguing that alienation is an inescapable prison. He's arguing, I'll use sort of Antonio Gramsci's language, the Italian Marxist, but he's taking up really an insight from Marx. And Gramsci says, it's as if we have two consciousnesses, or one single dual consciousness. And what Gramsci means by this is, yes, there are all these ideas we accept from the ruling class, uncritically absorb, and so on and so forth. And that's a product of alienation and reification and fetishization and the naturalization of capitalism and so forth. That's one aspect of working class consciousness. But Gramsci argues, drawing on Marx, yes, but there's all this other side as well, which is governed by the things that bind us together as humans through this process of collective labour. And in particular, when that labour is collectively mobilised in struggle against capital, and you begin to see in embryo form the possibilities of a different way of running society and a different way of governing human existence. And Marx puts it in his 1844 text, very interestingly. He says, he's talking about these communist workers he meets in Paris, he says, when communist artisans associate with one another, theory, propaganda, etc., is their first end. But at the same time, as a result of this association, they acquire a new need, the need for society, and what appears as a means becomes an end. And we can extrapolate from that. It's not just these sort of communist artisans that experience that. Every time we engage in collective struggles as workers, we get little glimpses of this new form of society which could be born through collective struggle. In other words, we have a glimpse and the ability to crystallise out what Antonio Gramsci talks about as the good sense that comes out of these collective practices of struggle and antagonism to capitalism. And this finally allows us to make sense of what we mean by revolution. Revolution is not just this act carried out on our behalf by this sort of clever elite of revolutionaries who go out and overthrow the government, and then we have a socialist society. That's not what makes a revolution for Marx or for anyone in that classical Marxist tradition. Revolution is how we regain our humanity for a collective form of activity through which we confront, challenge, and ultimately overthrow capitalism and all of the oppression and exploitation on which capitalism is based. And I think that's a very important aspect of revolution we sometimes forget. When we talk about revolution, we're talking about unlocking the enormous creative potential that exists within working class people. There's this lovely quote from the radical biologist Stephen Jay Gould, when he's asked about, he's asked about Albert Einstein and Albert Einstein's brain. He says, I'm not that interested in Albert Einstein's brain. He says, but he's aware that people with equal talent to Einstein have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. And that's the potential that we're trying to unleash through this process of revolution, which involves those people in sweatshops and cotton fields and the new dark satanic mills and the civil service and the hospitals and the schools and the universities and the Foxconn factories and so on, rediscovering their potential through mass working class struggle from below. In other words, it's a process inherently of self-emancipation through which we develop ourselves. Now, I'll finish on one more quote from the young Marx, which sums this up for me beautifully. He says, he writes of the revolution as the complete return of man to himself as a social, i.e. human being. A return accomplished consciously and embracing the entire wealth of previous development. Communism is a riddle of history solved and knows itself to be this solution. Thank you. I'll finish that.
Hi, I am from Socialist Alienation Czech Republic, the sister organization of SWP. So first of all, thank you for organizing this amazing festival. And I was thinking about when I heard the talk, or when I read the theory about alienation. I think the perfect example of alienation in the current times is the service industry. As a long-term worker in the service industry, I see every but there is no relation between me and the products that I sell, but also there is alienation between me and the customers who come to my shop and buy the product, because I think this is I'm not saying it's like a tool of the capitalist system necessarily, but it's the product of the capitalist system that the workers who become a customer at one point, but they don't see the person working in the service industry as equal, but they see them as like someone less, and they sort of become like an ally of the ruling class or the capitalist who owns the shop, because they just don't see the other person working there as equal. So that's just the point I wanted to make about this. And I would be really happy to talk with any of you later if you have any recommendations or any studies or texts on this topic of alienation in the service industry, because I've never read anything about it, never found anything about it. So if you know that if there is any next project you're wondering about this topic, I would be really interested. Thank you.
First class in here will be followed by the person in the second row with classes.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was really happy to hear you point out the continuity in Marx's work that goes all the way through from his early supposed humanist studies to sort of hard economic stuff later on. I was particularly interested about what you said about alienation as not being an inescapable prison. And that's why I wanted this idea of alienation as being a completely negative thing. I think Marx was still treating alienation in the way that Hegel treated it, as a necessary stage which had to be overcome. And so you used the word transcendent. I think Marx and Hegel used Aufhebung, like a sort of overcoming, assimilation of alienation, in the sense that the hunter-gatherer who wasn't alienated from their neighbour was never going to build a socialist society. You had to be alienated in order to overcome your alienation. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And just on examples of alienation, one that came into my head very recently was Palestinians in certain parts of the occupied West Bank. Because they are cut off from other parts of the West Bank, they can't go to work. And they're recently they're being besieged in their villages, but for a long time they've been prevented from working in the so-called Israeli economy. And the only avenue for getting any currency for buying goods is to work on the construction sites of the new illegal settlements on the land that has recently been stolen from them. And I just thought that's almost like alienation on steroids. That's almost like the next level of management. Thank you.
Okay, so this speaker will be followed by the speaker in the pink shirt in the middle.
Yeah, I wanted to make a point about artificial intelligence, which is an area that Joseph did mention, because I think it is a good example, modern example of alienation, since this is ultimately a human technology that we're being told is, assuming it was past human intelligence, maybe even better than step over the world. And I think that's a real sign of how, well, basically a human product. I mean, it's so powerful despite the fact it's a product of our own ingenuity history that we see as alien and foreign. And yet, on the other hand, of course, it could be a real threat in terms of jobs and all these things. And certainly the way it's filtering into all sorts of areas of life is phenomenal. I mean, I work at Oxford University, and we recently had a talk by someone telling how we could use AI in our work. And we're just using terms like these computer systems to reason and think. And I challenge that because I study the brain and how it works. And I said, well, actually, there's a fundamental difference actually in the way the human brain works and these systems work. That they use words like neural networks and neurons to describe these AI systems. And it's a fundamental misnomer in the sense that they are really quite different. That's not to say they're not very creative and clever in all sorts of ways. But I think the main point I made is that they do not reason and think because they have no sense of meaning like a human being. And so when we are told that we should introduce them to our work, we should be really quite critical of what that means, because in many spheres, whether it's education and other areas, they're being used to undermine work practices, to dumb down the whole process of education, that kind of thing. And I think we have to sort of challenge the idea that these systems are on the verge of becoming, I think, like a person. On the other hand, we shouldn't underestimate the kind of dangers in the way they can be used. And that means organising a work with higher education or any kind of job where AI has been introduced to sort of, basically reduce the work process. But we should also realise that as tools, they have real possibilities as well. I know somebody on Facebook actually is using AI to, make images and things like that are then challenging the kind of system, and that can all be a part of modern way of kind of reaching out to people and exposing the kind of contradictions under capitalism. I think ultimately it's a sign of how even the most advanced technology under capitalism can be used completely against us. And even just the environmental aspects of AI systems, they use huge amounts of energy, damaging the planet and the rest of it. Actually, in a social system, we would use these kind of technologies, but to enrich human society and also in a sustainable way, which is something that capitalism seems to be capable of.
Hello, first I wanted to thank the speaker, it was amazing. I wanted to talk about, and this is almost like relates to the previous speaker about alienation and artificial intelligence, but not really about the future destructive impact that AI might be creating, but existing impacts of large language models that exist today and how we might connect to alienation, especially in impact in the technology industry and software engineering. So it's already this is not a neutral industry, so technology has always been used to benefit capitalism, imperialism, and surveillance. And some sort of AI has been used in place for a while in logic that we usually call algorithms.
But nowadays, companies are planning to, or already using large language models to create code in place of humans. These tools are being marketed as time savers, but they remove creativity, agency, and human touch out of code that might affect millions or even billions of people, depending on where they are applied. These tools are removing the already fraught human aspect of technology and increasing the distance between ordinary humans and the tech products that we increasingly have to submit to. The loss of autonomy and rights of workers is something that we've seen before in countless other industries. But what's different this time with technology is how unregulated and uncomfortable the software industry is, and how wide the impacts of LLMs might be. It's important for all of us as consumers of technology to be aware of this when consuming AI tools or products that use AI code behind them. And it's crucial for tech workers around the world, if we have any working room, to organize around this issue and resist as much as possible to be replaced. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just really want to follow up the kind of theme of Joseph's talk, because I think that perhaps the very sum of alienation is when we talk about all the evils of our society, then I think what we're all about is getting into the root of the cause of the causes of these things. I just came from meeting on mental distress, and a lot of what Joseph was talking about, the feelings of disenfranchisement, feelings of insecurity, feelings of instability, feelings of the lack of predictability of the world, the lack of control over the world, is a tremendously important thing. So alienation is in effect the cause of the causes of so many of these horrors inside of our society. I think that that's something that I think is under-theorised, in terms of disability, in terms of mental health, in terms of all these things. I think it's something that really needs fleshing out a lot more. And I think that in the Marxist tradition, that's something that is beginning to happen, and I think it's a very, very welcome thing. Because we think about something, for example, the slogan, all power corrupts, right? And absolute power corrupts absolutely. So, that was actually directed against the Catholic hierarchy, right, at the time it was written. But the point of the matter is that something that is actually quite progressive can easily be turned into a very reactionary argument. Because the central problem that human beings have, and working people in particular, is a lack of power completely. And a lack of power is what corrupts people. Powerlessness is what corrupts people, because it makes you look to other people as the guardians of your existence, as the people who are going to make a difference to your life, instead of the idea that you yourself are capable of it. I mean, one of the central, if I get one more minute.
Yes.
Yeah, but the one thing, you see, the thing that we often come across is we say to people, we can have social society, but that's the problem is human nature, right? And you can think that, that Keir Starmer isn't fit to run society, but then you can think the problem is that, that workers are too greedy or selfish or whatever and all this kind of thing. The point I'm making is the way in which Joseph's explained that we are atomised, cut off from each other in a million different ways by capitalist work process, and the structure that gives rise to, it's the cause of the causes of the problems inside the society, and therefore it's a fundamentally important part of Marxist theory, and it's part of the argument why we talk about collective power, because collective power is not corrupting. Collective power is something that is enormously empowering, something that gives you more of a sense of your ability to influence not only just the course of the world and its events, but also your own humanity and its future.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to talk again a bit about AI and also using science. Cool. The recapture thing, the proof that you're not a robot, where they show you a grid of images, the way that company makes its money is by training an AI model off of your response to the recapture. They know some of the images have cars, but they don't know all of them. And you go, oh, that image is also a car. And they go, oh, interesting, that was a car as well. We'll just feed that to our AI model. And I think that's important about alienation, because what that is a company extracting free labour from people in order to train an AI model. And that is one example. But all companies that are building AI models are doing this. They went through the internet and they trawled through the entire output of humanity, and they stole all of that information and they used it to build an AI model. And now, when you go and use an AI model, they will train off of your data. You are doing free labour. So if you are indeed making protest art using AI. Don't do that, because you are doing free labour for capitalists, okay? They are training their model off of your data, and you absolutely shouldn't do that. And this is an example of alienation. I think it's an interesting example of alienation, because in the example of recapture, you know, if the workers at the recapture, went on strike, that would be devastating. That would absolutely harm the capture. But it wouldn't be the entirety of the workforce of that company going on strike, right? Because there are millions of people out there who are having their labour stolen by that company just because it sits in front of them and goes, oh, you can't go into this website until you do a little thing for it. Similarly, if all of the workers at something like OpenAI went on strike, that would be devastating for OpenAI. But they could keep training their model in the meantime while those workers are on strike. So when we think about organising against these big tech companies, we've got to understand that it is not just the labourers at those tech companies. The entire population of people who are using that product are also having their labour stolen. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to think about new forms of alienation, specifically, and this relates to things like artificial intelligence and increasing automatization, which is, and this is one of my idea historically here, which is these new forms of so-called intellectual work that do not only require a very mechanic, manual labor that is completely foreign to you, but a mental labor of research, of writing, of thinking that is still completely foreign to you, but is also something that does not only consume you manually, but also mentally and intellectually. And here the distinction between the work, the time that you have outside of work and the person you are outside of work becomes more visible in comparison to the person you are within work than when you do manual labor. And when we see a trend of this type of work becoming more and more common, maybe, and this is what Pierre argues, that type of alienation is actually much worse because it consumes you completely, than the classic type of alienation that may be boring, but it leaves your mind free. That's all I have to say.
I get to visit a lot of picket lines. One of the things I find fascinating is that people that are taking strike action have stepped over the threshold of their workplace, that are sticking 2 fingers up to the boss, will often sort of describe other people as, yeah, but they'll never do that. And you know, there's this terrible sense, isn't there, that a pervasive sense actually, that people are sort of bought off by what people describe as consumerism. And you know, people often talk about the sense that people are, you know, completely obsessed with their phones. And sure, lots of people are obsessed with their phones, but what Joseph's describing there, the central question of alienation from the labour process is what we have to return to, isn't it, and explain to people. But also it points away, doesn't it, that when we break from that by, for example, the key weapon that workers have, the ability to take strike action, that all sorts of things become possible when you do that, particularly over extended periods of strike action. And this gives the clue to revolutionary processes and why it is that revolutionaries talk about the ability of workers to throw off the mark of ages in revolutionary processes and so on. That when people take strike action, and particularly when they're giving control of their strike action, when it's not determined by trade union officials and so on, they start to get all sorts of ideas about how they can run their strike action, how they could run their workplace better, better forms of production that their job could be used for, you know, that perhaps isn't about producing weapons that go to kill people in Gaza. These are sorts of things that can become possible when people break from that alienated labour process. It's very important to return to the questions that Joseph raised about Gramsci and so on, and the way that this becomes you know, a battle between what Gramsci talks about, common sense, and questions of good sense, when people are starting to challenge those pervasive ideas in society that come from the top of society, but you know, that stem from the question of the alienated labour process. And I think we, you know, revolutionaries, we in the Socialist Workers' Party, we talk about how struggle unleashes the potential for people's ideas to change fundamentally. That yes, we can educate people, but when there is nothing stronger or more powerful than when people take action themselves and move into struggle for those ideas to start to change and for the possibilities of challenging the capitalist system to arise.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think Joseph touched briefly on the idea of reification, so the idea that social relations are seen as things rather than social relations. And one of the starting examples I come across a lot is the idea that networking is an important tool for your career. I think there's also a best-selling book out right now which promotes the idea that friendships shouldn't be seen just as friendships, but as a tool for advancing in your personal life or your career, and that you should never trust your friends, which is quite a sociopathic idea. I think that's sort of the state we're in, and the level of alienation, of reification that permeates our society, I think is deeply rooted in the era of neoliberalism, which also saw the crushing of the trade union movement and the traditional workers' parties. I come from Germany, and in the area I live in, the Rhine-Ruhr area, there used to be a saying, the SPD could have a broomstick run for election and it would win. That's history. That's no longer the case. They used to have sports clubs, workers, reading clubs, youth clubs everywhere around the area. Those are gone. So I think this has kind of two sides. It has one big downside, and that's, well, of course, the ideas of alienation and unification, etc., and neoliberalism, consumerism being integrated in the working class, and also there being an opening for the far right to step in and offer a solution that obviously won't help anyone. But there's also a side that I think gives us an advantage. If anger rises, the pot starts to boil and class struggle breaks out, and I'm sure it will break out. Maybe within the next years, maybe within the next 10 years, but if the attacks in the working class, the rise of militarism, of wars, of crisis, continue to exist, and I think they will continue, class struggle will break out, and at that point we face a reformism that has lost its roots in the working class, that doesn't have the strong roots, the traditions, the sports clubs, etc., within the working class, and I think it will be much, much easier for us to win away workers from reformist ideas. So I think on one side we're facing the issues of neoliberalism still, or neoliberal ideas still being deeply ingrained in the working class, of the rise of the far right, which we have to combat, but also we have to build a revolutionary party that's independent of reformism, and I think that when strikes break out, protests break out, and we're there, and we offer a solution that's not just, well, you can either vote, or you can maybe, if you're feeling radical, knock on doors and go tell other people to vote. Then we can, I think, win sways of workers before they have to go to the state or go through the stage of reformism.
So thanks again. I'll pass over to Joseph, who will sum up for us.
So thank you very much. Thanks for all the comments and questions. Let me say a little bit about artificial intelligence and how it relates to this discussion. I won't talk at length because there's other meetings at Marxism exploring this, but I think it's relevant in a few ways. One of the ways is that we often say about artificial intelligence, it's not intelligent in the way that humans are, and that's of course, absolutely right, and it's part of the critique and the notion of artificial intelligence. But I think it's also important to say what makes us human is not just a specific form of intelligence, it's the way that intelligence relates to a labour process binding us together with nature. We're dealing with completely different categories of things when we compare AI to human beings. And secondly, I think AI features in this in quite a lot of complicated ways. First of all, it's completely bound up with the structures of capitalism, both because, as people have said, it draws on this massive inputs from human beings at various stages, but secondly, it's completely bound up with these massive accumulations of capital, which are completely dehumanized accumulations of capital competing with one another, and completely bound up, by the way, of inter-imperialist competition. There's a very good article in the new issue of International Socialism by Anne Alexander exploring these connections, but it's really, really important to demonstrate the sort of capitalist and imperialist logic of AI and how it plays out. And you see this in lots of ways. I mean, my university, we're going through this pre-change process, which is unfortunately probably a prelude to a planned redundancy program, and they're getting lots and lots of my professional services colleagues into a room and saying, can you come up with ways in which you can automate your job and make everything more efficient using AI? I mean, I have to stand up as a union rep and say, we're all in favour of efficiency and making your job easier, but surely management should withdraw the threat of mass redundancies first, otherwise you're automating to get rid of your job. And this is a basic argument that attaches itself not just to AI, but to all forms of automation, which is the more we produce, the less we have as workers. And in a socialist society, the more that we produce in a sustainable way, with all the caveats and so on, the more freedom we'd have, the more we'd be able to cater to all-round human, cultural, human needs and all the sort of varieties of the things that we want from society. And finally, in terms of AI, it's deeply connected to the ecological degradation that Marx makes an element of his theory of alienation. Because when Marx says the labour process is a form of metabolism between humans and society, humans and nature, he also has in his mind that capitalist industry is a form of this mediation between human and nature takes under capitalism. In other words, it's a very profoundly distorted and degraded form of metabolism between humans and nature that we experience under capitalism. And that means that when we're doing or using artificial intelligence, we're not thinking about the extraordinarily destructive impact that this has on nature in terms of contributing to global warming, using electricity on a massive scale, and so on and so forth. So it's intimately connected with all these arguments. Secondly, very briefly, I love the contribution about service sector work. There's a body of writing going back to a woman called Hochschild, I think it was, who initially wrote about so-called emotional labour. There's a book called The Managed Heart, which tries to discuss the way in which, what's the subtitle of the book? The commercialization of human feeling, I think was the subtitle. And it's a really important contribution that talks about how this plays out in a service setting, talking about things like airline stewards and things like that. If you want a much richer and more Marxist version of that, Paul Brook, who is somewhere at Marxism, I don't think he's in this meeting, but Paul Brook is one of my colleagues who has written brilliantly about this topic of emotional labour and trying to root it in a Marxist conception of labour process. That's a little bit of reading that may be of interest. Thirdly, this idea of the artist as an aspirational figure. Let me just use that as an opportunity to say a little bit about art and alienation, because I think it's an interesting topic. There was a long debate in the Socialist Workers' Party involving particularly the late John Molyneux about whether art could be conceptualised as unalienated labour. And, we went down all kinds of weird rabbit holes in this discussion. To be clear, I don't think we can think of art as unalienated labour, but art is often practised not under the watchful gaze of the capitalist manager. And that's quite important. It's one of the reasons we might enjoy doing art or get a degree of fulfillment from artistic activity and so on. Even the terrible songs that I write about my cats and so on, and all this kind of artistic stuff. It's not great art, but it certainly gives you access to a range of feelings, emotions, experiences that you don't have in your day-to-day activity in the capitalist workplace. So art is very important in that sense, but art can never fully evade the logic of a capitalist society, both in the very prosaic sense that if you want to make a living out of art, you actually have to enter the art market and sell what you're producing. But I think at a deeper level, once you see capitalism as this reified system of capitalist competition losing control, because it's not true that individual capitalists wake up in the morning thinking, I want to destroy the planet. That's not how it works. The capitalists, as Marx says, might be very nice, might be a member of the RSPCA, might be kind to their children and so on, but they are destroying the planet because the system evades everyone's control. Because once you accept this logic, if you get left behind in that battle of competition, it's an existential question for you as a capitalist. So this logic of capitalism constantly exceeds our control over ourselves, society, and so on. And no artist can fully escape from that experience. So alienation, reification, fetishization, and so on find their ways into artistic practice as well in quite complicated, contradictory ways. Nonetheless, of course, art gives us a glimpse into a different kind of world, which is why we love art. And we are the people who say we want to take the best, not just of a future socialist art, but the great art of the sort of transition from feudalism to capitalism, or ancient Roman art, and even the art produced under capitalism. We want to build on that as we move into a social society, because we feel it's an enriching process that fulfills genuine human needs. Okay, final point. Someone asked about the relationship between Marx and Hegel and their concepts of alienation. There are very strong similarities and family resemblances, but very sharp differences. Hegel is this very important German philosopher who Marx studies in his youth. And for Hegel, alienation is a detachment of or it's a separation of the real sort of natural material world from what he calls absolute spirit, or God, if you like. And this alienation then leads to this long historical process through which humans begin to understand their separation from absolute spirit, and through a series of historical phases, grow towards more elaborated philosophical forms and other intellectual forms through which they can grasp their relationship and return to absolute spirit. So that's not a very good explanation. You can tell it's pretty complicated, messy philosophy, and it gives you a huge headache when you read it. But Hegel associates freedom with a passage through these historical stages through which humans grasp the working out of necessity in freedom, to slightly paraphrase Hegel. But for Hegel, labour is at its root abstract mental labour, and the process is a transition at the level of categories and concepts, not a material transformation of the world. It's a return to absolute spirit, but largely through mental labour. Marx takes all this and turns it on its head, and he says that this passage of historical phases is really a passage through different modes of production and different systems through which humans reproduce themselves and so on, culminating in the latest stage of this process, which is capitalism. And capitalism is this deeply alienated society rooted in exploitation, accumulation, and so on and so forth. But Marx also says there is this possibility of freedom, and that capitalism opens the door to freedom. In other words, capitalism creates for the first time the material basis for a world without scarcity. We don't need to have scarcity anymore under capitalism, but it also, just as importantly, creates the material force of society that can lead a transition to that future world, to a socialist world. It creates a mass working class who form the potential gravediggers for capitalism. But one very important aspect of this is that they're only the potential gravediggers. It's not a sort of automatic succession of stages, it's a historical possibility that arises from this point in history. And I think this is where I want to finish. A colleague of mine who's also helping me fight redundancies in the union asked me the other day, where do you get your hope? Where does your hope come from? Is it from the little victories we win? And all I could say was, yeah, I mean, the little victories are really important, because in these little victories you get the glimpses, the embryo of a different kind of world. But it's not just about the little victories. It's about how do we systematically tie these little victories to the big victory that we want to ultimately win. Where does my hope come from? Not from humanity as it is at the moment. I have a huge problem with humans, you know, all kinds of awkwardness with humans and so on. It's from this potential that socialism unlocks, the potential that humanity has as it rises up in struggle, which is ultimately the potential to destroy capitalism and create the world anew.